Welcome to the Indigo AV Mixer video training course. Over the next hour, we'll go through all the features of this unique and powerful tool. You don't have to know a lot about audio and video mixing to learn how to use this product. Once you've mastered these basic skills, you'll be able to jump right in and create incredible productions without a big crew or a big budget. Before we begin, let's take a look at some different types of connections. This is just a quick run-through. You can look over the back of your unit to inspect each type of connection more closely. A BNC connector is used for several different types of video signals. An S-video connector looks like this. It's used for video connections. A DVI connector is usually used for computer signals or to connect to high-quality digital displays, such as flat-panel LCD monitors and digital projectors. A FireWire or IEEE 1394 connector looks like this. It's a digital connection that can transfer large amounts of data quickly. Indigo treats these as streaming sources without a control protocol. An XLR connector looks like this. It's used for professional audio connections. A 1/4-inch connector is used for audio connections. An RCA connector looks like this. Indigo uses these only for audio connections. An AES EBU connector is used for digital audio connections. An RS422 or 9-pin connector is used to control remote devices that have a 9-pin connector. As I said, you can look more closely at each type of connector by looking at the back of your Indigo mixer. So now that we know what each type of connector does, we can tackle the back of Indigo. Let's just go through each section and talk about what it does, moving along from left to right, top to bottom. Starting in the upper left, we have 10 video input connectors. As you can see, there are 6 BNC connectors and 4 S-video connectors. The BNC connectors can be used to attach either an SDI or composite source, while the S-video connectors are for S-video sources only. You'll also notice that the S-video connectors have the same port number as the BNC connectors. This means that if you're bringing in a video signal on the BNC connection Mark II, you cannot bring in a video signal on the S-video connector Mark II at the same time. This is a good time to mention a little note. Anytime we talk about an input or output with multiple types of connections, you can select which input or output you want to use from the setup menu, but we'll cover that in detail later. The section to the right of that is for digital video input only via SDI. You have 6 SDI inputs here, all with BNC connectors. To the right of the SDI inputs is the program output. These 5 connectors are your main outputs for your show. This is your on-air output. In order to accommodate every possible scenario, there are 2 SDI outputs, 2 composite outputs, and 1 S-video output. Unlike the inputs, these connectors are all active at the same time. To the right of your program output is the preview output. This is a way to see what's on deck, so to speak. Your preview monitor will show the next change you are going to transition to in the program. You can output the preview to a monitor via composite, SDI, or S-video. Like the program outputs, these connectors are all simultaneously active. To the right of the preview output are the auxiliary, or aux outputs. These are single-source outputs that you can assign from the Indigo mixer, and we'll cover how to do that later in the video, as well as some uses for aux outputs. Here you have 3 pairs of outputs. Each pair has an SDI and a composite output. To the right of the aux outputs are the analog reference inputs and outputs. On the top left is an input, which you can loop through to other devices. The 2 outputs on the right are for sending out a reference signal generated by Indigo. Next to that is the RS422 or 9-pin connectors. Here you have 2 RS422 connectors to connect to any external devices with 9-pin control. These ports can be used to either control another device or for an external editor to control Indigo. To the right of the RS422 connectors are the IEEE 1394 or FireWire connectors. There are 2 6-pin FireWire connections available for input and output of DV25 signals. Next to the IEEE 1394 ports is the remote port. This USB-B port is not currently used. To the right of the remote port is a standard Ethernet port for connection to a LAN. This is the same type of connection you might have on your computer. Like the RS-422 ports, this connection allows Indigo to control other devices. Note that the power switch and power cord port are located to the right of the LAN port. Okay, let's move down a row. These next three sections are part of the high-res card. If you purchased it, your unit may have come with a high-res card uninstalled. For instructions on how to install the high-res card, just watch the chapter on basic service. The first set of connections in the high-res card is marked Computer Video In. This is a set of 2 DVI-I connectors and can accommodate the video signal from any computer with a DVI output. A simple adapter allows you to connect a VGA source here as well. Next, we have a set of 2 BNC connectors that are made to accommodate an HD or high-definition signal. These are digital video inputs for HD signals via SDI. To the right of the HD inputs are the DVI outputs. This will output either the main or preview channels to a projector or monitor with DVI inputs. The program channel is on the left, the preview channel is on the right. We then move off the high-res card and over to the AES EBU input and output. Using simple breakout cables with XLR connectors, this connector will accommodate 6 digital AES EBU inputs and 2 outputs, a main and a sub. To the right of the AES EBU connection is a general-purpose input and output, which also functions as a tally output for multiple camera productions. Let's move down to the bottom row. On the left is a series of 6 stereo pairs of analog audio inputs. You have 4 RCA connectors and 8 quarter-inch, also called phono or TRS connectors. Next in line are a series of 4 audio connectors that can either be XLR or quarter-inch connectors. They are stereo pairs as well. The left-hand pair are 1 stereo input, and the right-hand pair are another stereo input. The inputs may also be set up using the touchscreen menu as 4 mono microphone inputs. For microphone input, you also have the option to activate 48-volt phantom power, which can be activated and deactivated by these 2 switches here and here. To the right of the inputs, we have 4 analog audio outputs, 2 XLR connectors, and 2 RCA connectors. This is the main output. Finally, we have 4 connections for the sub audio out, 2 RCA outputs and 2 quarter-inch outputs. The sub output can have timing delay or a separate audio mix. Next to the sub out, there is a headphone jack. This is the same headphone out as the one on top of the unit, but just in a second location for convenience. The headphone volume control is located on top of the unit under the other headphone jack. So those are the connections. There are quite a few of them, I know, but as you can see, they are all pretty simple, and they are all clearly labeled if you forget what goes where. You can refer to the manual for more detail on how to connect devices to your Indigo. Now let's take a minute to talk about how the video and audio enter and exit the Indigo AV mixer. As you can see in this diagram, you have a lot of inputs and fewer outputs. In the high-res area, you can bring in 2 high-res inputs or upscale as many as 3 standard definition sources. You can then output a high-res program and preview channel, as well as downscale 2 high-res sources to standard definition. In standard digital video, you have 12 SD inputs. From those inputs, you can de-embed up to 6 channels of digital audio from SDI input sources. SD video has a program output, a preview output, and 3 auxiliary channels. Digital audio has 8 stereo pairs available for input and can receive up to 6 channels of embedded audio from SDI video sources. The audio can then be re-embedded in SDI video or output as part of the main and sub audio outputs. With all these connections, you can bring pretty much every type of media imaginable into your system. Analog and digital video, HD video, analog and digital audio, PowerPoint presentations, computer content, and much more. And with the RS-422 USB and LAN connections, you can even enable remote control of the mixer. Really is an incredibly versatile tool for live events. So let's start learning how to use this tool by moving on to the control panel buttons and subpanels. Now it's time to get into the real meat of things. Just like the back panel, the easiest way to get acquainted with the control panel is to go through it section by section. Navigating this field of buttons might seem like a daunting task, but these buttons are all divided into groups. Once you know what all the groups do, you will find it very simple to master this control panel. You will see that we have both a touch screen and a series of physical buttons. So let's start with the buttons. Unlike the back panel, we're not going to move left to right. We're going to start with the most important group of buttons, the program row. This row is lit by a red light and is the pipe that all the other buttons flow into. This group of buttons controls what is seen in your program output, which is your main output. In this auditorium, our program output will be shown on the big screen up front. You can think of the program output as your on-air output. The input sources are numbered, and those numbers all correspond to the buttons on the front. For example, in a default setup, if there is a video signal from a camera coming into SD input number 2, then pushing the button marked 2 will display that camera's video signal on the main program output. Right below the program row is the preview row. As we mentioned before, this is sort of the on-deck section. Whichever input you have selected in the preview row will be the one you transition to next. For example, right now, SD input number 2 is selected on the program row, and let's select SD input number 4 in the preview row. Let's say that SD input 4 is coming from a turbo player. So next time we transition, the camera input of 2 is replaced with the turbo player signal from 4. Simple. You might be thinking, these buttons only go to 10. How do I access inputs 11 and up? Well, it's actually pretty easy. Just hold down the Shift button at the end of the row, then press a number. This will add 10 to each number, so 1 becomes 11, 2 becomes 12, and so on. Now, you may have noticed that I keep saying SD input number 2, rather than just input number 2. This is because, as you may remember, there are both standard definition, or SD inputs, and high-res inputs on the back. And this brings us to our next group of buttons. By choosing SD or high-res in the default 2 ME mode, you are choosing which input you are selecting with the program and preview rows. So if SD is illuminated, then if you press 2, you are selecting SD input number 2. If high-res is illuminated, then pressing 2 will select high-res input number 2. So anytime you select an input, just double-check the SD high-res buttons and make sure you are selecting the input that you really want. The top row of buttons is the bus delegation row. This row of buttons works in collaboration with the buttons directly above. Using these two groups of buttons, you can assign inputs to keys, auxiliary outputs, and even to a freeze frame of an input and save it as a still. Here's a quick overview of how it works. Let's say we have a PowerPoint presentation coming in on SD input 9. We want that PowerPoint presentation to go out to auxiliary monitor 1, which is a small monitor that our speaker can reference on stage as they speak. All we have to do is press aux 1 and then press button number 9 in the bus row. Remember to double check that the SD button is highlighted, which it is. Now auxiliary output 1 is showing the PowerPoint presentation. Pretty simple, huh? You can do the same thing with keys, which we will go over in detail later. Just press key 1 and then press button number 9 in the bus row. Input 9 is a high-res source that we've scaled down to SD. Now the PowerPoint is the video source used in key 1. Let's move over to the next group of buttons called EMEM, or Effects Memory Buttons. Using these buttons, we can store certain effects, audio settings, color correction settings, and much more, so they can be recalled with a touch. We will cover how to save these states to EMEM later. So for now, just remember that this center section of buttons is for EMEM. These next buttons are all related, but a little bit different. You may have noticed that when I transitioned between the program and preview rows earlier, Indigo performed a simple dissolve. This is the unit's default transition. However, there are a lot of other interesting and fun transitions available. By illuminating the FX button, you are engaging the digital video effects. Now you can choose between a wide variety of cool options for your transitions. We will go over transitions in detail later on. Next to the FX button, you will see a series of 3 buttons marked Next Transition. By choosing one or more buttons here, you are selecting which elements will be affected by the next transition. If you select BGD, then just the main element or background will transition. If you select Key 1 and background, then both the background and the input designated as Key 1 will transition. Selecting all three will apply the transition to all three elements. You can choose any combination of these three to be affected by the next transition. A quick note here, Indigo can only perform 2 digital effects at once, so if all three are selected, then the background's transition will default to a basic dissolve. Right below these buttons, you will see a series of 4 buttons, 2 for Key 1 and 2 for Key 2. By selecting either of the buttons, you are choosing how to toggle the associated key on or off. When the buttons are lit, the key is part of your program. Next, we have a group of controls that all go together: the Cut button, the FTB button, the Auto button, and the Transition T-bar. All these buttons can be used to create different styles of transitions. The Cut button is pretty simple. It will perform a basic hard cut on whatever elements you selected in your next transition section. So if I select Background and then hit Cut, it will cut from my current program button to whatever I have selected in my preview row. The FTB button stands for Fade to Black. It will fade out whatever is currently showing on the program output and replace it with black. It will blink to show that you are in black. To fade back up, press it again. It fades over a set amount of time that you can edit in the transition menu, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The Auto button will start a transition that you have selected and automatically complete it over the amount of time you dictate in the transition menu. The transition handle gives you manual control over the length of your transition. Push the handle in the direction indicated by the blue arrows to complete the transition. To the right of the transition handle is the Audio panel. You have 6 faders that control the volume of each individual channel and 1 master volume control knob that raises and lowers the level of the master audio output. Each audio channel has an on button at the top that can be turned off to silence that channel. You will also see a PFL button above each fader, right here. This stands for pre-fade listening. By pressing the PFL button above a fader, you can listen to the audio as it sounds before it is affected by the fader. Although there are 6 faders, Indigo can control 8 stereo channels of audio. The other 2 are accessed through the touchscreen menus. We'll talk more about audio later on. That really just leaves a few more buttons. We spoke briefly before about the front headphone jack, and remember that the headphone volume knob affects both this headphone jack as well as the rear one. In the upper right of the unit, you will see a joystick and 2 USB ports. The joystick is used for positioning and sizing of keys, and the USB ports accept any standard USB flash drive for saving device settings or downloading stills. The touch screen is to the left of the joystick. The touch screen is a very versatile and important part of the Indigo mixer. We'll go through most of its uses in other sections, but let's do a quick overview of how it's set up. You will notice that there are 4 dials at the bottom of the touch screen. These are called digipots, and they are used to dial in information on the touch screen. When you choose an option on the menu, the boxes above each digipot will tell you what that dial or pot controls. The menus on the touchscreen are set up in a tabbed format, so touching a tab will bring up a new screen with new options. The touch screen itself can only read one input at a time, so using multiple fingers at once will not work. You can calibrate your touch screen by going to the Setup tab and then choosing Control Panel. Under Control Panel, you will see a calibration button. Press this, and it will give you the option to calibrate the audio faders, the joystick, the touch screen, and the lever arm. Press the touch screen button and the calibration screen will appear. Tap each cross as it appears to calibrate the screen. If you miss a cross, it will mess up your calibration, which will make it hard to navigate back to the calibration screen. In this case, just press down on all 4 digipots at once. This will take you back to the calibration screen so you can recalibrate the touch screen. Pretty handy, huh? So now we have gone through the basics of what buttons do what. Let's pick one group of buttons and explore it further. How about keying words and images over video? It's a great way to add some extra pop to your presentation. In this section, we're going to learn to apply a key to your video. In case you're not familiar with keying, the basic idea is that you can add an image on top of another image. For instance, in the local news, they usually key in a box above the anchor's shoulder that has the headline in it. Another example of a key is what's called a chroma key, where you replace a color with another image. To use the local news as an example again, this would be like the meteorologist standing in front of a green screen and then replacing that green screen with the weather map. With the Indigo AV mixer, you can do up to 2 keys at once. So for instance, you could put a PowerPoint as a picture-in-picture and also add a logo to the bottom corner of the screen, also known as a bug. The best way to learn how to do this is to show an example. So for this example, let's assume the following setup. We have a live feed from a camera coming into SD input 1. We have a PowerPoint presentation coming into SD input 9. And the bug logo is saved as a still image in the still store. We have assigned that still image to button 3. We'll go over how to do that later. So first choose SD input 1 on the program row to set the camera feed as your background. Remember to check that SD is selected in the Delegate section. Now look at your bus delegation section. Press the button for key 1. Now you will assign one of the inputs to key 1. You can do this by pressing a button on the top row, the bus row. Let's make key 1 the PowerPoint, so choose SD input 9. Input 9 is a high-res source that we've scaled down to SD. Let's make the logo bug key 2. Do this by pressing key 2 and then selecting SD input 3 from the bus row. Now let's take a look at these keys. You can see these keys on the preview monitor by selecting them with the next transition buttons. Then, when you make your next transition, they will move to the program output. In order to refine the keys, we've got to go into the sub-menus and set up the parameters. Let's start with the PowerPoint in key 1. I want the PowerPoint to appear as a small box or picture-in-picture over the presenter's right shoulder. So choose Keyer from the side tabs. You will notice that you have 4 tabs across the top of the Keyer section: SD key 1, SD key 2,